In this video, I'd like to talk about two different saws here in the shop. Both have a similar use, but are different in a very particular ways. So first off, we have the 14-inch Shopfox bandsaw. And on the other side of the room, we have our Delta scroll saw. Now, both of them can be used to make cuts that have distinct shapes, curves, things like that. But you will find that the bandsaw is best used for wood that's a little bit thicker, and it will not cut quite as fine curves and detail work. If you want to cut something that's thinner, smaller, has lots of small curves or ins and outs or details, you'll want to use the scroll saw. I'll demonstrate both in this video and how to use them. They're both pretty simple, but you can't get hurt on them, so you have to be careful. So first off, the bandsaw. It's called a bandsaw because its blade is a long band. That band goes around this flywheel on the top, and then it goes down into the bottom of the saw around a different flywheel. Now, to turn it on and off is very simple. There is an on-off switch, and it's clearly labeled on and off. When you turn this on, that blade starts moving through the saw. It's going all the way around both of those flywheels. Now, one of the most important things to know about this saw is because those two flywheels are iron and they have weight to them, when you push the off button, it takes nearly a minute for those flywheels to stop moving. That means that as that wheel is slowing down, the blade is still passing through the saw. You should not reach for your cutoff or workpiece anywhere near or around the blade until this flywheel completely stops moving. Because this saw is a bit quieter than some of the other tools, it can be deceptive, and you may think that it's not moving and not dangerous when it is. Please be very careful with this tool. It will hurt you just as quickly as any of the other saws, so you have to keep your hand away from that blade. A couple other things to notice about this before we make some sample cuts. There is a blade guide that you need to adjust depending on the thickness of your material. So you have an adjustment knob in the back of the saw here, but it also has tightener. So you need to loosen tightener, then you can raise and lower the guide. You should put this guide down within a 1/4 inch or so of your material that you're cutting so that you don't put undue pressure on the blade. Now, it's important when you're using this saw to not twist your workpiece too much. That can twist the blade. You will hear it start to rub against the workpiece, but if you twist too much or too quickly, you can snap that band, and then we have to replace it, and that becomes expensive. So please don't do that. The best way to get a good cut on the bandsaw is to cut slowly and to pay very close attention to your mark. So draw out everything that you want to cut first, and then work very slowly and methodically. This saw also has a fence, similar to the rip fence on the table saw, and it fits right over this track in the front. You have to hook it in the back first, and then set it down on the track, and then it locks in place with this little lever here, similar to the table saw. This is useful if you're trying to rip something that is one length and not so long, or if you're trying to do something where you want to make sure that you always have the same distance between the blade and the edge of the piece of wood. Say maybe you're cutting out the inner shape of a U-shaped piece of wood or something like that. There's also a crosscut guide and an obvious track on the surface of the saw for that to go. Now you will notice that this crosscut guide will bump into the blade guard. So you have to make sure that that guard is up high enough that you can pass by. Just like any other saw, practice your runs, make sure that everything is going to pass by the blade cleanly before you start to use the saw. So to demonstrate the bandsaw, I think I'm going to go ahead and cut out a push stick. So I'm taking this scrap of plywood, it's about 1/2 inch plywood, and I'm going to go ahead and cut that out to show you what it looks like and sounds like to cut something on the bandsaw. Another trick that you can utilize on the bandsaw if you do need to make a tight curve, what you can do is make some little cuts. So you see I've drawn this out, and I'm going to use this to also demonstrate the fence. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by making a round cut, then I'm going to add the fence and make this long straight cut. Now this would be tough to do on the table saw. You could of course rip this first on the table saw and then add the little round part. But to make this tight curve here, what I'm going to do is, before I start cutting this long cut, I'm going to make a bunch of small cuts that go right up to the line and sort of make a comb here. Then, when I start to cut with the bandsaw along this line, you'll see that each time I hit one of those cuts, it releases a little tension. It gives me a little more wiggle room to get the blade through. a couple of things you noticed there. One was that I took off my ring and I put on my safety glasses before I started using the bandsaw. I also opened the gate and turned on the vacuum system to draw the wood dust and chips away from the saw. Lastly, when I was using the fence, I used a push stick because I didn't want to put my hands that close to the blade. And to be comfortable getting the piece through the saw, I went ahead and cut the push stick. That is okay. Better to cut the push stick than your finger. Now, please, if it's a plastic push stick, like a nicer push stick, try not to cut those. But these homemade ones, they're made to be used up and we'll make another one. So don't sweat cutting these if you need to, especially if you get in the middle of a cut and you don't know how to finish the cut and it's your only option. Go ahead and cut the stick. It's fine. This is our Delta scroll saw. This is used for making small cuts, making small shapes with tight turns. Now it's got a very simple on-off switch right here. And the way that this saw works is when I turn this on, this head just starts going up and down very quickly. Now it's variable speed, so watch what happens. I can adjust the speed depending on the materials. Very hard woods need a high speed to make a clean cut. Softer woods can use a lower speed. You can also cut metal, like very thin metal, copper, things like that, softer metals. You can cut plexiglass, plastic. I've used it to cut styrofoam panels. You can cut cardboard on it. This is sort of a do-all saw. You just have to be careful about how quickly you move the material through the saw, and you have to play with the speed adjustment until you get something that seems like it's working well. So I suggest having a few scrap pieces and playing around a little bit on the saw before you start working on your final work piece. A couple other things to mention about this saw. There is a small cup here in the front with a spring-loaded knob, and this just catches dust. When you're finished using the saw, go ahead and just empty this out in the trash can and put it back. Also, these saw blades are removable. There's a little tensioner here, and when you pull that down, you can slip the saw out of the blade out of its cradle. It's just a little wire blade that goes from the top to the bottom. Now, this can be a little tricky the first time you do it, so if you need to do that, let me know and I can help you. But the benefit of that is that you can drill a hole in something and fish the blade through it and then cut from the inside. And that way you don't have to make a cut through your material to make that little inner hole. So this is a great way to make unusual shapes on the inside of another shape, like a window or a hole cut out of something. All right, so I've drawn this funny little organic shape on a piece of wood, and let's see how the scroll saw does with it. Now, before I start cutting, I'm going to lower this guide by turning this thumb screw here, dropping that down until it's just above the material that I'm cutting. And that way, when I start cutting, my material isn't banging up and down, and I get a smoother cut. So now you get a sense of what the scroll saw can do. The blades on this do break. If you're going to break a blade in the shop, this is probably going to be one of the blades that you'll break. They do wear out after time, and if you break a blade on this, just let me know and I will fix it. The speed setting is sort of the catch-22. To have a finer cut, especially in anything that's a little bit harder wood, things like that, you have to turn the speed up. Turning the speed up also means that you may break a blade. Having the speed low, it's less likely you'll break a blade, but you may get a sort of rough edge, a little furry edge to your cut. So sometimes it's a trade-off and you might have to sand it a little bit. Thanks for watching.